Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed. I'm Arjuna, and this is the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. Today I've got Akhandadi Das and James Fodor on to discuss consciousness, physicalism, and so on, the science around Vedanta ontology and whether it's contradicted by the science, and a lot of that centers around arguments based on the hard problem of consciousness. So Akhandadi and James, thanks for coming on today.
Pleasure.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
And could you each tell us a little bit about yourself, starting with Akhandadi?
Okay, well, I'm a Vedanta philosopher studying issues particularly of consciousness and reality. I'm particularly interested in how some of the insights from Vedanta philosophy, Sankhya and yoga traditions can, offer ideas and insights and maybe new perspectives on some of the issues of philosophy of mind, nature of reality, that Western science and philosophy have been discussing for years. And I think there is some interesting crossovers.
And James, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure. So I am pursuing a PhD in decision neuroscience at the University of Melbourne, and I have a background in, a few different scientific areas, mostly neuroscience and physics. And I have an interest in philosophy, particularly, epistemology, philosophy of mind, and responding to apologetics from, mostly Christian, but I also engaged with, Arjuna and other guests that he's had on a few occasions. So I'm interested generally in sort of worldview questions, and trying to think about how we can have, productive conversations between people with different perspectives.
Cool. So we'll start off with Akhandadi giving a basic Vedanta ontology, and then James can give his thoughts on that.
Yes, I thought that at least to create a kind of platform for discussion, what I would start with actually is a little analysis of what we mean by the hard problem of consciousness. And before we actually look at ontological issues of that, I think we just need to make sure we've defined it and understood the nature of what we mean by this so-called hard problem. And what we're trying to explain through different theories. So I've got a few slides. I'm going to take them in chunks, if that's all right, James. We'll look at one little bit of it, have a chat over that, see where we are on that, and then that would kind of act as a foundation for the next bit and so on. But that's all right. So the actually ontological bits probably coming a little bit later. Although I'm not going to be a very long presentation. It'll take a few minutes just to kind of go through each chunk. But if there was something that you wanted to come in on, please feel free. It's a conversation. It's not a presentation as such. All right. So I'm going to share. Arjun, if you could let us know if that's.
Oh yeah, screen share. Yeah, it's coming through.
So
give me a second to pull it up in the software in here. 1 second.
Great. Okay. The hard problem. We put it in the inverted commas just because it's a quote, obviously from David Chalmers originally, and it's something that's been adopted. But I think it's been useful to at least identify what we are challenged with trying to understand and explain in terms of conscious perception. So I want to start using an illustration. James, you may be familiar with this. Is from various papers that Christoph Koch, who worked with Francis Crick, produced. This is the first part of it. So I'm going to reveal the illustrative bit by bit, just for the effect of this presentation. But we're looking at what does it mean, what actually happens when we say we experience things visually. There's the external world. Just to clarify, however, I was written up as some kind of in between idealist. I'm not. I'm a kind of realist as such. I believe there's a real world out there, and light from that world bounces off these objects. Here we have the man walking his dog in the park, and the light then comes into our eyes, and there's sensory processing. In this case, the eye is receiving those the different wavelengths. They're activating various photoreceptors and sending an electrical signal down the optic nerve into the brain. And Christoph Koch then shows us what is happening inside the brain, that various neural activity is happening, charges flowing from one neuron to another. There's patterns of that electrical activity. It represents the data, it represents information linked to the external view. And electrical signal shown that as some kind of down the optic nerve into the brain. This is sort of encoded information. And that's all fairly straightforward. We're learning more and more exactly how that those electrical messages are received, processed, and activating areas in the brain. Perception, or the percept, we should probably really say, that the experience that I have of this process is of an image, which is really interesting, because the question then arises, well, where does that image exist? If we say it's in the external world, well, that's been, in one sense, deconstructed, decoded through the light waves. And the image doesn't actually exist in the light waves, but obviously it recreates a little image at the back of our retina. But again, whatever that image is broken down by, it's the kind of pixelated version. The individual photoreceptors are being activated, and a kind of aggregate of all that information being sent as this electrical signal. So the image as such has ceased to be an image, but it is now a collective of data. And that's what we get in the back of the brain. And although there are kind of processes within the brain that start to try and analyze that data in various ways, we cannot say that there is a specific image in the brain, but somehow or other there must be some mechanism that decodes the neural data and presents it as a percept, a visual percept. So that percept then has qualities which are specific to it as a percept. We do relate, and this is a hard thing, I think, for many people who haven't really kind of addressed this question before. We just make the assumption that the qualities of our perception are there because they are the qualities of the external world. You know, the external world's out there, there's a person, there's a dog, they have shapes, they, in a particular location. So of course we're going to see a picture of that. But philosophically, it's not as simple because of the way information has been transferred from that reality of the external world to the experience we have as a qualitative percept. And the qualities of these percepts we call qualia. And that's a way of at least acknowledging that our perception has its own qualities, which we should distinguish from whatever the qualities are in the external world, which of course are correlated and gave rise to the type of qualia we have. If we change what we look at, we change our percept. If our eyes, the sensory processing is adjusted, like both of us are wearing glasses, that enhances the sensory process, so that helps and changes our perception. If there's issues within the neural processing, and that will affect us. But ultimately, the percept that we enjoy as part of our conscious experience has these particular qualia qualities. And James, is there anything on that you want to kind of comment on?
Well, I mean, most of what you've said, I don't have particular disagreement with, although it seems that what you're driving at is that there's some, I don't know, disconnect between the neural processing steps that were shown here and the generation of the quality of percept, that there's something else that's sort of not shown in the diagram. I don't know if that's exactly what you're saying, but that's the vibe that I was getting.
Well, I'm sure that's the suspicion that you might have. Let's put my what I might be driving at to the side, because I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to say, oh, there is something different. But I am indicating that the quality of information, or the format of that information within the brain, as described as NCC, these neural correlates of consciousness, that's Christoph Koch's and Francis Crick's terminology. The format of the way information is contained and processed in the brain seems to be of a different format and have different qualities to that of our percept. Now, I'm not saying that one can produce the other. That's a different question. We're just kind of acknowledging that this is part of what we consider to be the hard problem, that we are very in tune, or we're gaining more and more understanding of the nature of neural processing. But within that, we still have the issue of qualia, why there are qualia and how qualia might have arisen from the neural processing.
Yeah, so I agree. I mean, qualia is a tricky concept, but I think for purposes here, we can say, yeah, the qualia are a thing, and many physical states do not give rise to qualia, and so there's a question to be asked about, in virtue of what do particular physical states give rise to qualia, and how does that work? So yeah, I think that that's an important question.
But which examples would you give for physical states not giving rise to qualia?
Well, as far as we know, I mean, we don't know exactly what physical states give rise to qualia, and I think that the best examples of that would be, we don't really know what it's like to be a bat, for example, as Nagel wrote in his paper, or other cases of animals, or sort of how far down, if you like, it goes in terms of whether lizards have qualia, or fish, or ants, or so forth. Presumably a bacteria or a tree doesn't have qualia, for example, whereas humans and presumably apes do. So somewhere along that spectrum, I would say that there ceases to be qualia. It's almost certainly a spectrum in terms of complexity, and the qualitative nature of what it is like to be that type of organism would change. But I mean, from my point of view, as far as we know, the only, talking about life on Earth and not speculating about elsewhere in the galaxy, the only types of physical states that exhibit qualia are minds of a sufficient complexity.
Yeah, well, let's put it this way. Therefore, when we're now bringing in mind.
I should probably say brains. I mean, yeah, brains of a sufficient complexity. Let me put it that way. I mean, I don't always draw a strong distinction between those two, but here I should probably say brains.
No, that's right. And I'm going to just suggest that we use a little bit of a distinction to try and help us here, that we need to invoke a kind of phrase like mind in order, and that doesn't mean that mind isn't a brain function. That, if I'm not saying we have to discard that, for this analysis, but I'm saying that it's kind of useful, and we do it. We bring in mind as a sort of, to try and catch how this function of generation of qualia might occur. So we then put qualia into the kind of mental states category. That's fair enough?
Yeah, I would say that qualia, well, I would say certain mental states exhibit qualia, or instantiate qualia, or have qualia.
Yes. I mean, I'm actually in favor of the idea that almost any mental state that is apprehended has an element of qualia. For instance, we generally talk qualia in terms of sensory inputs, visual, and we can talk a little more about visual and color, sound. There's a pressure wave, but we experience that as what we call sound. I think smell is an interesting one because it's actually hard to consider where smell exists outside, because we know different chemicals and their molecular shapes seem to stimulate different smells. But it seems to be a kind of lock and key arrangement. I know there's kind of questions on the lock and key explanation, but no one has kind of produced a better or an alternative view. It seems that certain molecular shapes lock into receptive shapes, so the chemical acts as a key going into the lock of some receptor in the nose, and that stimulates a smell. So that's an interesting thing, that the smell is kind of connected to the lock and key, or even to what's behind the lock and key. It's like opening a door and you get something. So it's hard to link even smell to the nature of what is smell in the external world, or is smell specifically qualitative in our percepts.
Well, I mean, I don't think any perceptions or qualia exist outside of minds, right? So vision doesn't exist outside of an organism that's capable of forming that percept. Likewise with smell, or likewise with sound. I mean, sort of that old adage, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound, right? If we understand sound as a type of percept or qualia, well, then the answer would be no, right? Because the relevant form of processing that's necessary for that to be realized just isn't present.
Actually, thanks for using that example. I think it's very good, because the difficulty with English language, we have two concepts for sound. One is the percept sound, and the other is the physical.
That's right.
Physical sound, which is the vibration, which of course we would say does exist, but the percept doesn't exist. Yeah, in one of the interesting ones I was musing on recently is color. Where is color in the external world? Now, I'm not saying that the external world isn't color, but it's very hard for us to tie it down, because is color in the object? Well, if so, I have no contact with the object. I only see the light that's bouncing off the object. But light isn't colored, is it? Photons aren't colored. And there's certainly no color in electricity. And there's no color in the brain. But I experience the qualia of color, redness. I experience redness as redness. So that seems to be something that isn't present along the rest of the chain, or the line of information that we've been showing.
I mean, yes, I agree. There are certain processes that have to happen for that sort of percept to develop. And I mean, presumably different organisms that have different, not just different brains, but also different photoreceptors, presumably perceive colors very differently to we do. Although, I mean, it's sort of hard to know, but that's, I think, a reasonable assumption.
I think that's fascinating, that we are trichromats. We have three different wavelength receptors, and that gives rise to our experiences. And we mix colors. And where does mixing of the colors happen? Like, for instance, Isaac Newton, when he was doing his spectrum work on light, he was thinking, well, okay, if wavelengths are colored, I've got different wavelengths for these different colors. That's great, but where's magenta? Where's magenta in the spectrum? There's no wavelength that represents magenta. But when we get a stimulus of what we call the blue wavelength and the stimulus of the red wavelength, we experience magenta. But where's the mixing happening? It's not happening in the wavelength. It's not happening in the eyes. It's not happening in the electrical signals. It seems to be a new color that is generated, through in this process of producing qualia.
Well, I mean, I think the right way to think about it would be that all colors are produced in the process of producing qualia. Again, acknowledging that ambiguity and the notion of color between because color isn't really wavelength anyway, right? Like some colors correspond to specific wavelengths, but some are formed from mixing wavelengths. And so I would say it's all sort of produced in the brain.
Well, it's certainly all produced kind of, these are qualities of perception, color, whichever they are, and you're quite right. Just while you've mentioned about other creatures, what do they experience? Are they experiencing color qualia? I mean, we say bees and other pollinators are attracted to the colors of flowers. Is it just some kind of stimulus response, or actually are they qualitatively experiencing those colors? Would be an interesting kind of, and we can muse on this one. All we know is that when we talk about qualia amongst ourselves as humans, it seems to be a common factor and a real factor.
Yeah, that question is very interesting. I suspect that there might be something that it is like to be a bee, but I suspect that it probably isn't very much. I mean, language sort of fails us here, right? Because it's not clear what it means to say that it's not very much. But I mean, I think you can kind of get an idea that when a person has significant brain damage, then it's clear that they have much reduced capacity to receive stimuli, interpret, and understand the world. And beyond a certain point, well, that person progresses from having some brain damage to just being brain dead, and they may have sort of minimal function in the brainstem to keep their heart and lungs going. But beyond that, there's presumably not really anything there, so to speak, or the lights are out is another way to put it. There's no qualia, presumably. And so maybe there's just a few iota steps above that where there's a very minimal, tiny amount of qualia or sort of consciousness present, and maybe a bee's consciousness in some way resembles that. But this is all very vague and speculative. We don't really know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good analysis. The University of Queen's University in Belfast did a study looking at pain, because painfulness is another kind of aspect of qualia, and they tried to develop a bunch of criteria for kind of lower species, if you like. Don't mean to demean them, for other species, by which they might act in ways that were against their own interests. They would release analgesics. They would do various things that would kind of indicate that the stimulus of pain wasn't just creating a reaction, but might have been creating a kind of felt experience of painfulness. Now, again, there's only so far you can really take all that, but it was an interesting study, I thought, a good attempt.
Yeah, I've read a little bit about that sort of thing. I don't remember all of the details. I think it's very hard because a lot of those things, it's not entirely clear whether you can't explain that without I mean, an analgesic, for example, there's other ways to explain what that might be doing sort of chemically in terms of reducing the intensity of the stimuli over time so that it doesn't, because you don't want the stimuli to continue to be present at the maximum extent, because otherwise you can't be responsive to new stimuli. But I mean, so there is a problem with those methodologies. I think that there is, though, evidence that there's, again, the way I would put it is that there's something it feels like something, or there is something to be, an animal experiencing those sort of stimuli. I think it is, the word pain is a bit problematic because it encompasses so many things in humans. And I don't know that, like pig pain is exactly the same as human pain. I mean, I think it almost certainly isn't. But it may be appropriate to use the word pain if it's sufficiently similar. But I think it is easy to, well, this is just my opinion, but I think it is easy to over anthropomorphize animals. I mean, in the past, people made the opposite mistake, like saying that animals are just machines and there's nothing at all. But some people, I think, go the other way and just sort of think of it as basically a human but can't talk or something. I think that that's probably wrong because there are there are very large differences. In the nervous system and in other facets. So I guess the point I'm making is I think that we should exercise caution in deploying a word like pain or really any other psychological concepts to animals, because they're likely to only be analogies and not, exactly the same thing as it works in humans.
Yeah, I agree. I remember listening to a zoologist speaking on this point that you made and saying exactly that, that in the past we really did, we went the wrong way. We were over kind of viewing them just as stimulus reaction beasts with kind of no feelings. But at the same time, we don't want to Disneyfy them and with anthropomorphism. But his point was actually without some anthropomorphism, without some kind of empathy or just projection of our own mentality and psychology onto animals, he said you can't understand what's going on. Then there has to be some, but you've got, as you say, you've got to be very careful. And there's only so much that we can understand and infer, which is why when really in talking about the world of consciousness, it's tough, but we have to kind of just keep it amongst us humans at the moment, because at least we're able to discuss it and report on what we're experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, consciousness is such a difficult term. I think it's, when talking about animals in that context, I prefer to talk about animal suffering rather than animal conscious. Well, like in the context of concern for animal welfare, which is often an area of where this comes up, right? I would prefer to use language like suffering, which I think is much more general, rather than talking about consciousness or pain.
But if suffering isn't a felt experience, then does it count?
No,
as
I'm not
suffering?
implying that. I'm not implying that it's not a felt experience. I just personally find that to be a more general term, because there are types of suffering in humans, for example, that you maybe wouldn't describe as pain. So I don't know. I mean, that's just a personal language preference. I don't necessarily hang too much on that.
But I don't think there's any. Is there any suffering in humans that isn't a felt experience?
No, probably not. But that wasn't the
So
implication I was drawing out with that. I'm saying that suffering and
but
pain aren't the same
sorry,
thing.
I was teasing on this point of suffering because, like, I have a mower that broke down. Is it suffering?
Oh, what?
I don't
Sorry?
think so. A mowing machine.
Oh, a mower.
That's
Right. Yeah.
this
Presumably
mower is
not.
meant to
No.
be looking after my grass here. It broke down the other day, but I don't think it's suffering. So, so I think that's the issue, though. I think many people have denied animal suffering on the basis that if it isn't a felt experience, then it's not really, it may not look nice and the animal may be, hobbling around or bleeding or, making noises, but is it a felt experience?
Yeah. No. What I'm saying, I think it is, right. But what I'm saying is the word pain to me is more specific. So, if I'm
Okay.
hungry or cold or annoyed, I mean, those aren't pain, right? But they're still a felt experience. But I would say they're all forms of suffering, or at least if they're intense
Yeah,
enough, they're a form of suffering.
absolutely. No, I think we're good on that. All right. So if we just go back to our little chart, we've kind of got these, the qualitative percepts, qualia, but the hard problem doesn't really stop at that. The other element of the hard problem is that where is it? Yeah, there appears to be a sense of the I, the subjective experience aspect of that I have a sense of myself existing, and part of what convinces me of that I exist, and part of what it means to exist, is that I experience stuff, and the stuff I experience actually is the qualitative percepts, the qualia. So, is this a further kind of function that needs to be addressed within the overall picture of, if you like, the hard problem of phenomenal consciousness?
I mean, subjective experience. I guess that's a phrase that can be used in different ways as well. In one sense, I would say that sounds a lot like qualia, but the way that you were describing it is more the experience of being a subject. And in that sense, I don't know that there is. I mean, I don't really have much to say about really how that works exactly. I guess we can think of it in terms of, animals that maybe pass the mirror test or something like that. An idea of an ego distinct from the environment. These sort of things seem to me to be, again, products of a sufficiently complex brain, particularly I think with a sufficient degree of social processing. So it seems to me one of the reasons, possibly the main reason, that humans have the capacities that we do, such as language and like theory of mind, is because of our need to interact socially. So we develop ideas about us as distinct from other conspecifics or other humans, and being able to think about what they believe as distinct from what we believe, and their wants as distinct from our wants. And there's some interesting research on this in other social species as well. So it seems to me that, once you get a certain complexity there, and with the right evolutionary pressures and so forth, we develop, or at least we have developed, this cognitive faculty of understanding ourselves as sort of agents distinct from our environment and as distinct from other people.
Yeah, I think we want to be to kind of hone in on maybe making some distinctions here. We certainly have a sense of ourselves that I exist. I have a sense that I am existing, and that has an I factor. We do interpret who we think that I is in terms of almost formulating an ego concept of ourselves, which of course is based on how we see our body, the things that our body can do, the things that our brain and mind can do, the things that way we interact socially, and all that. And that, and self identification, or understanding self-identity, and does seem to be a more human factor. I'm not sure that it's, I think it's a special cognitive skill that humans have for whatever reason. But what I think that we have to see is that at the heart of it, there seems to be something which is giving rise to the sense of myself as the experiencer, as the subject of my experiences, and that is distinct from the object of my experiences, which are qualia. So I would not say that subjective experience is qualia. I think subjective experience is the experience the experience by the experiencer of qualia. So I would make that, slight distinction, and just for clarification.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to that. I don't entirely understand the distinction, but I'm happy for you to make it.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify maybe for some of the listeners, when we talk about subjective experience, we don't mean subjective just in the way that is my personal perspective on things. Rather, we're saying it's my experience that what is happening to me, I see myself to be the subject, the person I see, I feel, I hear. I am the person undergoing experiences. Now, that's what we mean in this case as subject, as a kind of case, the nominative case, subject. Of course, being the subject of my experiences naturally then allows me to have a kind of psychologically subjective perspective on the world. And that kind of follows. So that's subjective experience. So in one sense, I'm saying, and again, we're not saying that either qualitative perception or subjective experience cannot be or is not related to brain activity. But in terms of defining the hard problem, we do need to be able to take all of these factors into account. And that's this is kind of John Searle's kind of criteria. The unified qualitative subjectivity is the kind of challenge for any theory of consciousness. Have you come across, John Searle, that particular phrase?
Yes, I'm familiar with that phrase. I think the phrases like that have a lot baked into them about what is meant by unified. What was the second one? Qualified, or is it?
Qualitative.
Oh, qualitative, yeah, qualitative and subjectivity. To me, there's a lot of baggage in all of those. I mean, broadly, I'm agreed, but I feel like it sort of all sort of the devil's in the details. It all depends on how you want to unpack those things.
What do you mean by the baggage?
Well, like the notion of what does it mean for consciousness to be unified, for example. It feels like that there's a lot that could be said about that. Well, sorry.
Sorry, please do. Yeah, I'm really interested to hear your view on that.
Oh, well, it's almost where to start. So, I mean, there's so much of our consciousness. Well, I maybe shouldn't say consciousness. There's so much of our mental life that we're not aware of. And so already off the bat, I'm not entirely sure if that counts as like a unified consciousness. You might say, well, it's just the things that we are aware of that are unified. But then there are some interesting experiments like the split brain experiments, which just for our listeners involve where they have there have been interesting cases where they've had to cut the fibers that connect the two hemispheres of the brain for certain patients, the corpus callosum, and they've done experiments which allow them to present particular stimuli to one half of the brain versus the other half, and essentially are able to, without getting into all the details of the particulars, but they're able to elicit different responses from essentially different halves of the person, because one half of the body is controlled by one half of the brain, the other by the other half, and language is mostly lateralized to the left hemisphere. So there's sort of these strange effects that you can get where it almost seems that it seems that consciousness isn't really unified under these conditions. Now I don't know that those are definitive.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Sorry, James.
Well, I was going to say I don't think that's definitive, right? But it's sort of a little unclear as to how to interpret results like that if we're under a notion of unified consciousness. This is what I was saying. Like, it feels like there's a lot that, like, what do we mean by unified? How unified is unified? What is unified? So those are two things that just come to my mind immediately when we talk about unified, because I'm wondering what would count as not unified, or like, what is the extent of that unification?
Well, I think that's a really good example, the cutting of the corpus callosum, because it actually demonstrates the difference between the diversity of our experiences and the unity of the experiencer. Because in those experiments, the patient senses that they are getting two different stories, if you like, about themselves and about their mind. But the interesting thing is the unified individual, the singular individual, feels that they're getting two stories. So the experience says the input, the mental states are not unified in that situation, as you described. But the experiencer still feels themselves to be singular. The same individual is feeling two inputs. So that is where the unifying experiencer is. And I think that's what Searle is getting at, because you're quite right. Mental states are certainly not unified.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question, right? That seems to be more a phenomenological question. Does the experiencer always feel unified? I mean, I don't know even how to assess that exactly. We have expressions in the English language that at least hint at an idea that it's not always true. I'm in two minds about this. But that's
separating experiencer from mind. And that's what we've just been kind of talking about. These things certainly give kind of credibility to this model of separating the experiencer from that which is experience.
I'm not quite following you there. What do you mean separating the experience from the experiencer?
That you said I'm in two minds, and that's a good example. I think that's a very good intuitive thing, that I have mental states. One mental state says, I think I should do this. Another mental state thinks I should do that. But I am the person having to, if you like, adjudicate my two minds. But I am singular. So it does seem that there is a singularity of a unified experiencer who is, in one sense, trying to cope with the fact that the mind, or the inputs that we're getting through our own psychology, is multiple.
Yeah, I mean, it's at that point, it's sort of hard to know. I mean, that aphorism that I mentioned there is just sort of gesturing at how we maybe think about the unity of consciousness. It's not supposed to be sort of evidence for anything very particular. But it seems to me that there's a problem with the view that it could become unfalsifiable, right? Because if you imagine, I mean, there are extreme cases of like, I remember there's one case where, or maybe there's a few cases, I'm thinking one in particular, of conjoined twins who actually have connected brains, right? And they are clearly separate people, but there is transference of thought between them, and, you know, they control, one controls half the body, the other controls the other half, or at least, you know, down to the waist or wherever they're separated. So, I mean, those are very extreme cases where you could say, well, it appears that there's two minds that sort of interact. And then in other cases with individuals who have... who have well, but this is the point that I'm getting at, right? So there's other cases like schizophrenia, or there's split personalities, or there's at a very sort of mundane level, I'm of two minds about this. But precisely the point that I'm making is, in any of those cases, you could just say, oh, well, there's two minds, or that there's one mind. Like, I don't know how it's all about how you define the unity, right? If you define it in just the right way, so that you're going to say, oh no, it's always either, no, there's an I, there's a singular there, or no, there's actually just two different people. Then, like, I don't even know what utility the concept is having at that point, because it's just sort of always defined to be one or the other. It seems to be unfalsifiable, and that's precisely the point that I was making. Is it depends on how you want to cash out that concept. If unity of mind is defined in a very specific way, then, I mean, well, yeah, I guess that there is unity of mind, but I at that point I don't know what analytical use it's giving us.
All right,
value it's giving us.
I'm not saying that there's unity of mind, because I'm trying to separate the functions of mind and saying that there seems to be an additional function of consciousness. Now, I know in Western philosophy, you know, brain-mind is conflated, and certainly mind-consciousness is conflated. But I think that's not helpful. And I think the examples that you've given show the lack of clarity that exists because of not separating the specific nature of the function of consciousness, which give rise to myself as the experiencer, the existing experiencer, and separating that from the content of my experiences, which are generated and presented to me through mental states. So, and if you look at each of those examples, like, for instance, the conjoined twins, where you said there seem to be two persons, then that seems to be two conscious functions, two individual subjects seem to be sharing a mind. Fine, that's very interesting. But they seem to be two individuals. And similarly with schizophrenia, we understand that because the patient reports themselves as an individual suffering from the fact that they don't understand why they seem to have several different ego personas and personalities that seem to represent them. But it's the one individual complaining about that kind of disorder. So I think that there is something very valuable for our purposes of analysis in neuroscience, science, psychology, and so on, for being very clear that consciousness is to do with the ability of the experiencer, and that what we are conscious of are the various mental states with their qualia. And I think that's just an important distinction that, as I mentioned earlier, I'm interested in some of the insights maybe from Eastern philosophy. And I think that's one little insight which could go a long way to expanding how we in the West kind of look at this whole business.
Yeah, I must admit, I'm not really understanding the distinction that you're trying to draw there. What you seem to be saying, if I'm understanding this correctly, is that there's a distinction between the experiencer, the subject, and any particular thing that they experience. Is that correct?
Yes.
Right. Well, so, I mean, at one level, that's obviously true because we have different language for these sorts of things. So, I mean, I think we probably mostly agree there, but maybe not, right? Because at one level, I want to say, I don't think that there's anything to what it is to be, you know, a subject or to be an experiencer, other than like all of the things that you've ever experienced / are currently experiencing. It seems to me if you took all of those away, I don't know what would be left. And well, yeah, maybe I'll sort of leave it at that. I guess so. That's the sense in which I'm not sure I understand. I mean, you're saying the distinction you're drawing is very important, and I'm not. I guess maybe I'm not seeing why you think it's important, or at least in the sense of with respect to our discussion, what hangs on this distinction.
Well, I think that ultimately what we are looking to care for, if we are applying the science and psychology of mind to try and help people, I think we're ultimately trying to help that individual who believes they exist and that they are the ones experiencing, because it is their experience of the felt kind of percepts of their mind which is ultimately causing them difficulty. Like when someone goes to the doctor and they've got a pain, it's the doctor's treating the broken leg or whatever it is that needs attention, but ultimately the person that is being cared for is that subjective experiencer, the one who is saying, I am experiencing such and such a feeling. And I think that's true in psychology, and I think it's true when we try and help the world. So I think being aware that the consciousness seems to be has an additional flavor to it beyond just the content of qualia in the mind. That qualitative percepts, in many ways, I think, follow very closely to a sort of information processing system. But that seems to be of a different quality, again, from the nature of experience of that. It takes an experiencer to be able to experience the experience of the mind. And I think the English language lets us down doesn't serve us very well on this one, because so much of our terminology is because of conflation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really disagree with anything you've said. I mean, I feel like there probably are underlying disagreements, but just to backtrack, this originally came about when I questioned the idea of unification of consciousness. And I mean, I still question that. I don't know that it would be entirely helpful, though, well, at least it doesn't feel like that discussion was entirely helpful, because I don't know that we have very clear criteria for what would count as one way or the other way. So perhaps we could just move on to something else. And if that's relevant again, maybe this will come up again in the discussion.
All right. Okay. So I think it is part of my kind of presentation that the functions and properties of consciousness as the unified subjective experiencer are of one kind of format, and that of the mental states, and including qualia and all the percepts that we gain access to, are of a different format. So, and that they're a different format from neural processing. So I think what I'm kind of really coming to is that in identifying the hard problem and articulating how we're going to deal with it, we have to recognize that we seem to have three sets of functions. The body-brain, biological and neural functions, we've got a pretty good idea how that works. Mind and its mental states and its functions in order to generate qualia. And consciousness functions, which seems to be the observer, the witness of those mental states. So that's kind of a three-function model of phenomenal experience.
I mean, so perhaps unsurprisingly, this isn't how I would maybe categorize things. I mean, I do think all of these things exist, right? So one could classify them that way. Maybe to start into the discussion there, though, I mean, I would say that subjective experience, consciousness functions, and mind mental states, I mean, all of those things, in my view, are produced by the body-brain system. So they're particular sort of facets of what it is to have a body-brain of a certain way, is one way to say that. I mean, that's not inconsistent with what you said here. I don't know if that's what you have in mind, though.
No,
maybe I shouldn't say have in mind what you think.
Yeah, I agree that what you just said, that they're all the functions, could be said to be consistent with what I've presented. And I think that's right. And I also take your point that each of them, we know to be real. We're not postulating something new, different to what we've ever thought about as, part of reality in the natural world. So I think that they're each a kind of real facet. And would we also agree that, where we go, that they do interact? There's obviously interaction between them. It seems to be a very kind of free flow. And that interaction could be modeled as an exchange of information. I know this isn't how you would choose to categorize it, but in terms of a functional kind of breakdown, I just wondered.
Well, I mean, yeah. So I would say that the right-hand side. Oh, how to put this? Each element on the right could be described as a subset or a particular functioning of the thing on the left. So I think subjective experience and consciousness is a subset or a type of mental states and functions, which in turn is a subset or a type of biological functions or the body-brain system. So in terms of exchanging information, I mean, with that caveat about there being one as sort of a subsystem of the other, I mean, I guess one could describe it that way. I mean, yeah, it doesn't seem very natural for me to say it that way, like that the mind exchanges information with subjective experience. I mean, I think subjective experience is an aspect of the mind, but there are parts of the mind that aren't, conscious or part of subjective experience, and that there's certainly exchange of information between those. So, yeah, acknowledging that's maybe not my preferred way to describe it, I don't exactly wouldn't say that it's wrong or that I disagree per se.
Or could I put this, is there anything inconsistent with science in this particular analysis?
Well, I just think it's very vague. I'm not sure what you mean by exchange information. I mean, in a general sense, sure, but if we're going to get down to specifics, I'm not exactly sure what you mean.
All right. Well, let's put it this way: that we said that the brain. We're dealing with kind of perception. So the brain has received sensory input. And we were analyzing that as visual data, that's in the brain. So that's in a format, a biochemical, electrical format, yeah? And we've said that qualia are a sort of representation of that, but it's a different qualitative format of information, yeah? And our experience of that would then entail some transfer of the experience is a transfer of information. I am gaining information about such and such. So that's kind of really all I'm saying in that particular point about the exchange of information. Maybe just stepping back from that a second, just the fact that I've kind of analyzed these three functions. Is there anything inconsistent with science in that way of analyzing them?
Well, I don't really have anything different to say than I just said before, other than that at a very abstract level, I mean, I think that's fine. But it depends exactly how you want to understand. I mean, I think that the notion of exchanging information is especially problematic because that has a particular. I mean, information has a specific meaning when we're talking about understanding how information is processed in a neural system, like in a computational sense, and that has a technical definition, which I suspect you probably don't mean here. But then that raises the question as to what you do mean by information. And I mean, I would not say that qualia. I don't think qualia are analyzable in terms of information content. Now, I could be wrong about that, but that's just my suspicion about the nature of qualia. So in that sense, I wouldn't agree.
Well, no, and I take your point absolutely on that. And that's really what I mean by the exchange of information. I think we've got, would we not say, though, that in some way qualia are meant to represent the quantitative data of information that is in the brain? There's meant to be some correlation there, isn't there?
Well,
you're not saying qualia are so completely kind of far gone that they have no relationship with the data in the brain.
Oh no, certainly they do, right? I mean, that's why there's mappings between particular perceptual states and particular how to put this particular. I don't know how to say this without saying perception. Particular stimuli and perceptual states that are associated with that stimuli. That's a good way to put it. I don't know that, however, that qualia serve a function. I mean, they might. I'm sort of agnostic about this. The way I would describe qualia is that it seems to be that qualia is a word that describes what it is like to be a particular type of information processing system or cognitive system, perhaps is a better way to say that. That's, as I was saying before, like what is it like to be a bee or a pig or whatever. It turns out that there is a way that it is like to be a human experiencing such and such stimuli. Whether the qualia itself serves a function, I don't know.
I get away from Nagel for a minute, because I think his "what's it like to be a bad thing" is a fine little kind of thought experiment just to start exploring this. But I don't want to kind of tie down qualia purely to what it is like to be something. Certainly, qualia is connected with what it is likeness of to experience something. Like there is a what it is likeness to experience redness. You've got a red microphone. I am enjoying, the redness coming through on that. So that's my point about there is a natural connection between the data format in the brain and the percepts. So there's a correlation there. But as you said, in the brain, the information processing can be quantitative, and we can analyze it in particular ways. And we can't do that with qualia, which is what I mean by saying, therefore, qualia are, there's information. There is, the qualia of redness is different from the qualia of blueness. And I take that as, in my experience, that is an informational difference. But it is hard to analyze qualia with the same mathematical rigor that we can do for neural activity. Therefore, that's why I say it's just a different format, but that there is some exchange or relationship of information content between the two.
Maybe we could call it analog information. Analog doesn't, you can't capture all the information that you have in an analog thing digitally. Even just like a single sound, like a song, if you fully captured everything, you couldn't possibly record it all digitally, because the curvature of the wave, eventually you're going to get to a graininess with it. So that might be relevant. It seems like, James, you agree that there's something exchanged between the mind and the content of experience. You just don't like the word information. Is there a better word that you'd like to suggest?
Well, no, I'm not too keen about the idea of describing it as an exchange. I think in a very broad sense, you can put it that way, as I said, because, subjective experience is the way I would describe that is that it's conscious functions maybe is a clearer way. It is a type, or they're types of mental states. And there's certainly an exchange, an interaction between non-conscious mental states and conscious mental states. And likewise, there's other parts of the body that they interact with. So at a very broad level, I'm happy with that. But I think that as we move into the specifics, I'm disagreeing a bit more, because I wouldn't say that qualia are like an analog representation of some information, whereas digital processing of the neurons the processing of the neurons is digital. For me, I think it really does come down to what it is like to be something. And just to respond to the point before about red, for example. I mean, that's what I think about, at least when people talk about qualia. I think about, so the qualia of redness is something like, what is it like to be an organism of a certain type, experiencing, maybe again that's not the right word, but experiencing the stimuli of a particular type of combination of wavelengths with a particular neural architecture, all of the relevant stuff that might affect that. That's what the qualia is. It's just what it is like to be in that particular state. So I don't know that there's any sort of informational content to the qualia beyond all of the informational content in the stimuli that gives rise to the qualia. I don't think that there's like something else in the qualia, if you see what I mean by that. I mean, I know that's a bit unclear because the language is unclear here, but the qualia to me is just what it is like to be a processing being exposed to particular stimuli effectively.
Well, yeah, I mean, qualia refer to the qualities that exist within our percept. So that means, there are different, and qualia is plural. So there are different qualities of redness, blueness, and so on, and plus all the other kind of sensory types. So it's not just what is it like for me to experience redness, but there is a difference in the qualitative experience of redness and blueness. And because those percepts have different qualities, different qualia qualities. And therefore, if there's something has different properties or different qualities, we may not know how to informationally define that. And I agree that this is a problem with qualia. But that doesn't mean we can't. And maybe I am struggling with when using the word information in that sense, because if information has a very much quantitative kind of processing meaning, then maybe I'm stretching the word information. So yeah, if there's a better way of kind of discussing these, then that would be helpful. But it does seem that if we have information in the neural information in the brain, we have qualia qualities in the in our mental states, and there's a sharing. There seems to be some kind of sharing of what one is and how it affects the other, if you like.
Yeah, see, I don't know about sharing. I don't know that qualia cause anything, and that might be a difference here. I mean, yeah, I don't know that I'm too committed to that, because I don't know that we can know either way, but it seems to me, I'm just sort of thinking about how I would describe this, that, yeah, qualia are what it is like to experience something, being a certain having a certain type of constitution. And obviously that's different, right? If you see a blue thing versus a green thing, then it's different. The constitution is different, so it's a different experience. But I don't know that that somehow interacts with anything else. That just is what it is to be, what it is like to be experiencing that thing as a particular organism. And it will be, I presume, subtly different for different people. I mean, it's certainly different for me as someone who's colorblind, right? I know that I don't perceive the same things when I see the same color as other people. So, but there's obviously going to be a lot of commonality across human beings, and less commonality with other organisms.
Yes, I think this my diagram might be slightly misleading us on this. In terms of two-way information, it's not clear that qualia are feeding back into the brain. I'm not suggesting that. There may be other mental states that might do that feeding back, but let's go back to this point, that you see these three functions as being, or at least the two on the middle, or the mind in the middle and the consciousness on the right, as being products or integral with the body-brain neural functions. Yeah?
Yeah.
So what is the evidence for that?
What is the evidence for the idea that the body causes mental states, or the brain specifically?
Yeah, and particularly, when we talk about mental states, let's be specific, qualia.
Well,
and subjective experience. If these are the two functions that we have kind of identified as real and connected with as part of this whole picture of our phenomenal experience, what is the theory that ties them together? that is actually a causal explanation, not just a correlation.
Well, I mean, the most straightforward observation to make is that there's no clear evidence for any mental functions in the absence of the relevant physical substrate. So that is no disembodied minds.
We could discuss that there could be experiments set up that might help on that. But
well, were there such evidence, then that would count against my position, right? So that's a piece of evidence that I would point to.
Well, what is the actual mechanism by which the brain generates mental states, particularly qualia perceps, and the experience of those of qualia? What is that mechanism?
Well, that's a different question. The question you asked first was, what's the evidence that it does? So we can discuss the second. The second is obviously a much harder question, because that's asking for a mechanism as opposed to evidence that there is a causal relation.
All right. Well, then
I'm happy to discuss either. I'm just identifying that they're different questions.
Okay. Well, then maybe we go back to the first one then, because you started on that. Is there anything else that you want to offer on that?
Yeah. So what was the first thing I said? The first thing I said is that there's no evidence of mental states in the absence of the relevant brain state, which I think is, very strong evidence. Then we consider the sort of details of what we know about the connection between mental states and brain states. So the development of the brain over over the development of human beings from the fetus through babies, children, mirrors the development of the brain. Likewise with brain lesions and other types of brain damage, the extent of damage and the particular patterns of damage also reliably mirror, maybe mirror is not the right word, but correlate with mental dysfunctions. Those are, again, probably the simplest forms of evidence for this. There's more, more recent types of evidence that we can get from, brain scans and transient lesions and things like that. But I don't really think it's necessary to appeal to those to make a general point about that. There seems to be very strong evidence that brain function gives rise to mental function.
Yeah. Now, James, I know that in a number of your analysis, and you've kind of offered it today as well, you say there are other ways of looking at that evidence. There are other explanations that could give rise to that evidence. And I think there are. That if you looked at this model, if you assumed that consciousness was its own factor and that mind was some kind of interface between the neural activity and the data contained within it, and mind was in some way taking that data, representing it for the experience of consciousness, then exactly what you have said would fit that model. That if there was damage to the brain, the mental states would be different, the sense of consciousness would be different. If the brain was not receiving sensory input well enough, then, as in, early stages of the embryo, etc., and, through its gestation and birth. So you would expect there to be that sort of relationship. So that is, in very simple terms, that would be a different narrative to the same evidence, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, if we're comparing different explanations, then what we need to do is look at the explanatory virtues of the compared hypotheses, right? So we want to look at the explanatory scope, explanatory power, and the plausibility or simplicity of those explanations. And then from my point of view, I don't think that there's any evidence that points to anything beyond the brain as necessary or sufficient to give rise to mental functions. So obviously there are people who disagree with that. And then the question is, well, let's take their profit explanation and then compare it and see the relevant virtues.
Okay. So where in the brain are qualia?
Oh, well, that's a very hard question.
Well, surely you need to address that. If you're going to say that we only need the brain in order to explain everything that we know to be real, we should be able to address that. And if we can't address that, surely the question remains open.
No, I don't think that's true at all, because you don't need to explain how something works necessarily to be able to say that it is causally necessary for something. So I can make a crude observation that if I cut someone's head off, that is necessary for them to stay alive because they die if I cut their head off. But it doesn't mean that I therefore have to explain how the head is necessary for them to stay alive. Or if their heart stops working, I might notice people need hearts to stay alive. But I don't need to have a theory of the heart being a pump and the role of oxygenation in the blood in order to draw the observation that the heart is necessary to stay alive. So although I think there are things to be said about where the consciousness, where qualia are in the brain, our knowledge of that is still quite primitive, as I'm sure you know. But I don't think that we need to offer a specific explanation for that in order to draw the conclusion that the brain is necessary and sufficient to give rise to qualia. And coming back to what I was just saying before, it all depends. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I apologize.
It all depends on the explanations that are being proffered. So if a scientific neuroscience is unable to give an explanation for, how and where in the brain qualia arise, but a competing theory does, then so much the better for that theory. But if no theory is able to offer such an explanation, then I don't think that counts for or against any particular theory. It's all about the explanatory merits of the theory compared to their ontological costs. And that's how I think we should be evaluating the theories.
Okay. Well, look, we'll come on to the ontological costs in a bit. Because the thing is that if we can't identify where in the brain qualia are, or how subjective consciousness arises from the neural activities, we can't be sure of what we're going to have to add to the picture of the brain and what cost that would have ontologically in order to create those explanations. You can't say we're being parsimonious.
I've disagreed with that. I gave some arguments as to why I don't think that's the case.
Well, remind me of which arguments.
So I gave the argument about the heart, right? You can observe that if you destroy someone's heart or cut off their head was the other example, that those things are necessary for them to stay alive. But you may not have any idea about how they work. I mean, I may know that I need to put petrol in my car for it to run, but have no idea about how the car runs. You don't need to have a theory of how something happens in order to know what the necessary and sufficient conditions are for that thing occurring. They're separate questions.
And that's the thing, that we are not actually sure that the brain alone is the thing that is acting when we have conscious experience.
Well, I mean, that's my view, right? I'm saying that's the view. I know you don't agree with that.
The narrative is, I think you've got a circular argument going, because if you have, if consciousness requires these three functions, if there may be three different elements that are required, so it's not just the brain, but you need mind and you need a consciousness function, an entity of consciousness or whatever it is. If you need those three functions present, then chopping off someone's head may certainly disrupt all of that, but that doesn't prove that it was singularly the brain responsible.
No, that wasn't the purpose of that analogy. The purpose of that analogy was to illustrate that understanding a mechanism by which something happens is not necessary for establishing a causal connection between one thing and another thing.
And my point is that without a mechanism, you cannot be sure that it is the brain alone acting when it comes to producing conscious experience. Because you can't, the brain is there, but maybe it's just one of the elements that is actually required in order to fill out this particular picture of the other functions, because we cannot see the functions of mental states in the brain. We can't find that at this moment. Maybe we will in the future. That's a different story. But at the moment, we cannot find them. And we cannot find what are the functions that give rise to subjective experience in the brain. So possibly there is more to the picture than just the brain. And it would seem rather, simplistic just to be relying on one of the elements, which doesn't seem to have the qualities, properties, and functions of the other elements that we need. And saying, well, eventually we'll find it. So I don't accept your thesis that it is sufficient just to say the brain is enough. It may be. I'm not, we do not know. But at this stage, we cannot find these other functions. We haven't a theory even to how they might arise within the brain. That's a bit of a deficit. So maybe we just need to be a little bit more open on this one. Maybe it is all the brain. Maybe that is the case. But we certainly don't have the evidence in front of us to make that as an absolute surety.
So a couple of points to draw out there. One is, and you did say that we can't be sure that it's only the brain. And I asked why not. And there does need to be a clarification there about sureness. So I'm not implying certainty, right? But I think we can be sure in this sort of, well, maybe I'll say the scientific sense of, sufficiently confident to assert that. I think that there is more than sufficient evidence there. So as long as we're on the same page about what I mean, when we talk about can we assert this or are we sure in that sense? We don't mean certainty because there's always a possibility. So that's just a clarification there. Now, a second point is the idea of because we don't know that because we haven't identified the specific mechanisms, therefore we can't be sure that there isn't something else that's another ingredient. Now, I don't think that's true for a couple of reasons. One reason is that even if the mechanisms were identified, it still wouldn't establish that there wasn't something additional, because it's never possible to rule that out. Because you can always say, oh yeah, yes, I see that there's all of these neural mechanisms, but in addition to that, there's this other thing. There's no way you can possibly ever rule that out. For example, there's an idea, well, actually, rather than say it that way, I'll move to the second point that I was going to make, which relates to that, which is that I think the reason the way we rule things out is not by somehow showing that they don't exist, because I don't know how you show that something doesn't exist. The way that you rule things out, in my view, is that, in scientific postulate sort of thing, is that you provide explanations for a phenomena that renders them unnecessary. So an example of this from scientific history is the idea of a vital substance, or elan vital, that people used to think was, well, I don't know exactly what it was supposed to be, but it was something non-physical that imbued a particular organic systems with life, and that made the difference between things that were alive and things that are non-living matter. Now, with the developments in organic chemistry and cell biology and so forth, we developed explanations for the mechanisms of how cells worked, to the point where it simply, if it ever was at least, but it was no longer necessary to appeal to elan vital. Now, that doesn't prove that there is no such thing as a vital substance. It still could be there. It still could be essential to give rise to life, right? There's no way that any scientific experimental hypothesis or evidence could falsify that. But what I would say we have is explanations about what is it that makes a cell alive that make that unnecessary to postulate. And I would say we, although our understanding is not as developed as that, we have sufficient evidence to say that we have enough understanding of how brains and minds work that we don't need to postulate anything beyond the mechanisms of the brain. And that's the sense in which I can say that we're sure, again, understanding that's not 100% confidence, it's just sufficient confidence, that there's nothing beyond the brain, is that the explanations we have mean that it's no longer necessary to postulate anything beyond. That's my position.
Okay, and thank you for that. I think that's really helpful. I think the difference with the elan vital aspect is that we've already identified that we're dealing with real things here. We're not dealing with something speculative. We're dealing with mental states, which have qualities, qualia, which are real. We're dealing with our experience of them as the experience of the subject. That's real. So these aren't new postulated entities and things that we have to, we're just going to keep adding to the picture. These are phenomena we have to account for in our theory of what produces and our conscious awareness. And what we've seen is that the brain, although it's certainly one element that is crucial to giving rise to our conscious experience, it doesn't seem to contain the functions that are the essential parts of conscious awareness, i.e. qualia and subjective experience. The brain is a brilliant processing system of sensory inputs and our motor systems, but it doesn't seem to contain those other two elements. Now, if you are going to claim that we don't need to, the brain can do it, I think you have to do a little bit more than say that the brain is required. It may be required, but is it enough in itself to produce the conscious experience? That, I think, you have not established, and I don't think you've offered evidence on that. If you can produce a mechanism by which qualia and subjective experience can be easily shown to be elements of neural activity, then I could say, well, that's great. Now we can all bring it back into one thing. But at the moment, I don't think that evidence is available anywhere.
So I haven't actually claimed to make a sufficient case for this here. I've offered a few sort of gestured at a few general observations, but I wouldn't claim that that's a sufficient case. To make a sufficient case, we'd have to read through a decent section of books like this and talk about all the specifics, because the brain is very complicated, right? But to make a few general observations about what you've said there, I think perhaps I wasn't clear about the way the analogy of the elan vital is supposed to work, right? Because the analogy is not between the vital substance, the postulated vital substance, and mental states, right? The analogy is between living substances, living things like cells and the functions that they carry out, metabolism and movement and growth and all of that. That is something that's an observed and known phenomenon, and we're attempting to explain that. Elan vital was postulated as a substance that explained the difference between living and non-living matter. We now explain that using organic chemistry and biochemistry and such. Now, that doesn't rule out elan vital. I think it renders it explanatorily unnecessary, but you could still think that it exists. Now, the analogy there is with the mind and qualia and mental states. They're analogous to living cells and their functions. And the analog of elan vital, as I take it, is anything beyond the physical brain and our environment and our interactions with it, anything beyond the physical world. The analogy there is that some people, and I don't even know that you're doing this, but at least some people postulate substances or entities or processes beyond the natural order as necessary to explain the existence of the phenomena of mind and qualia. My contention is that those additional postulates, there's no way to rule them out, but they're explanatorily inert, because I do not think they add anything to our explanations of how mental states and qualia exist. To make that inference, I do not need a reduction or a full explanation of the mechanisms of how the brain gives rise to qualia, because remember, even if I had those, it wouldn't rule out just like the elan vital case, it doesn't actually rule them out at all. The question is, does adding something to your theory, or your ontology is the fancy language, does adding that to your theory add explanatory value? Do I get explanatory value by postulating elan vital? My claim is no. Do we get explanatory value by postulating things that exist beyond the physical brain and our environment and interactions with it? And my claim is that we don't. And that is why I don't believe in anything beyond the physical brain and such. It's not because we've somehow ruled it out or that we have a full mechanistic account.
No, I think I understood your use of the analogy quite well, and maybe I didn't then articulate my response. But just, I think I understood it exactly as you're saying, that because of our increased and enhanced understanding of biology and how cells work, we don't need to postulate or include something like elan vital within the picture. And I'm saying, fine. But we haven't advanced in the same way in your neuroscience to the point where, like in biology, we can explain so much of what's going on inside the cells that we can say we don't need this other thing. So that's the difference. We haven't advanced that far in neuroscience because we're not able to show the same level of processes that give rise to the effects that we know happen within biology. And if the effects that happens from sensory perception is that I experience qualia, then you can't say we understand sensory perception, because if we don't understand how it is perceived by us, we haven't actually explained the situation. So we are very much in a very early stage, and therefore it isn't appropriate that at this point we dispense with other factors which aren't speculative, but which are functions we know occur. And I'm just asking you that at the moment, we don't know how the functions of mental states and qualia and the functions of subjective experience fit in and are explained within a picture that is solely restricted to neural activity. And it may be that, down the line, you might be able to handle them. But at the moment, we can't. And I understand you have the conviction and belief that we don't need to go beyond what the brain is capable of. But I would say that's part of a belief bias rather than pure objectivity in this situation?
Well, I mean, I'm not really interested in your analysis of my psychological state. I'd rather stick to the arguments, right?
So, I apologize.
Well, that's fine. I just, want to focus here. But I think a key point that I do want to make is that I'm not saying we should dispense with known phenomena. We shouldn't dispense with mental states or consciousness or qualia. Although, I mean, there's issues with exactly what do we mean by those things. But I don't think we should dispense with them. I'm not the limitativist. So we're in agreement there. Now, what I'm saying is that we should dispense with is postulates of things that are not known or observed phenomena, but that are added to try to account for, in this case, like what gives rise to the mind, or where does it come from, or how does it work? And you haven't advanced any particular theory of that, so I won't argue against any particular theory. I mean, I don't think the theories are well developed, but what I will say is any sketch of a theory that I have heard about what this might look like, I don't find to offer any explanatory value, but does come with an ontological cost. It says, look, there's this stuff that exists and it interacts with these ways, and it makes all of these claims that I don't think are testable. And if they are, I think have been falsified. But I don't think adds much, if any, explanatory value. And I say, well, Occam's razor that out, right? We don't need those things. Postulates like that, as I think in science and in philosophy, they need to earn their keep. They need to show that they can provide us with explanatory purpose. Or explanatory roles in our theories. And I do not believe that I've not encountered and I'm not aware of theories that I think earn their keep in that sense. And that's why I reject them. Now, I am open to the possibility that such theories will come across, and I'll be like, well, wow, there's a revolution in our understanding. That's great. Nobel Prizes around. This is excellent. But my confidence that will happen is very low. And it's precisely for this reason that people have been trying to develop such theories for a long time. I don't think they've even come close to succeeding. In comparison to the progress that has been made within neuroscience, which I acknowledge, to draw another thread that you mentioned before, is still not nearly as developed as our understanding of cell biology, but I think has developed immensely in the short time that neuroscience has existed as a discipline. And there are things that can be said about how the brain gives rise to, especially mental states. Less can be said about consciousness, although some things can be said there. And we could talk a little bit more about that if you'd like. But what I would say is that I think in terms of, if you look at what theories are earning their keep and what postulates can we justify, that's why I restrict myself to the idea that it seems to me that the brain will be sufficient for explaining these things.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And I apologize if I made any comment on your psychology.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to focus on the arguments.
I think there's a couple of things that may be useful, and that is to look at certain phenomenon that this model might help with, and also to look at the ontological cost, as you say, of this model. Maybe we could just look at that initially, because maybe that would be useful for me to clarify, and we might be able to find something that is approaching common ground.
I just have a quick point. I wonder if an analogy might be useful here. Like, say there's a vending machine, and the physicalist, for the sake of this analogy, is just saying you put money in, you push the button, and that's what causes the chocolate bar to come out. And for the analogy, we can't open up the vending machine. It's something we can't open up. We can't access non-physical things and look at them. They're not accessible to us empirically. So the physicalist says it's just the money and the button that does it, and the dualist or Vedantist says, no, there's something inside. There's another thing that does it. In the sake of this analogy, it would be the levers and mechanisms. So with qualia, the Vedantist or the dualist is saying there's another thing. There's consciousness. There's an observer, and this is what's responsible for these things. Because for the money in the button, we know that the money in the button can't, sure, if you don't push the money in and push the button, you don't get the chocolate bar. So the physicalist, might be saying, for the sake of analogy, if you don't have the brain, you don't have consciousness. But similarly, we have reasons to assume that just putting the money in and pushing the button couldn't be responsible for the little thing turning and the chocolate bar falling.
Well, thank you, Arjun. There may be some use in the analogy. I think may be helpful. However, I'm going to push back on. I do not want to be identified as a dualist. Okay, and I'm not trying to create a dichotomy with physicalism in that sense, in that way. So, but we're just going to go on to the ontology. But just want to pick up first on another point you said. I agree that neuroscience has advanced incredibly, and it does offer some insights into mental states. But mental states, without any help in understanding their qualitative nature and qualia of those mental states. We know that certain neurotransmitters, help in, this mood or that emotion or this experience and so on. But we still need help in understanding qualia. But let's go to the ontology bit. My point in suggesting that, we have three real entities and they interact. Therefore, I suggest that because of that, they have we lost James?
He's back. There we go.
He's back. Sorry.
Sorry. Biological malfunction there. I clicked on the close tab instead of what I was. Sorry. Keep going.
No, sorry, I didn't say anything. I think I'll just go back. So we have three real functions that seem to interact. That, to me, sounds like they all belong to the same ontology, the same singular reality, however you want to describe it. So I'm not a dualist in that sense. I believe these are all functions of one reality.
Yeah, well, I mean, dualists would agree. I know you're not a dualist, and I don't pretend to understand exactly what your position does entail, but I would say that a substance dualist, let's say, would agree that mental substances are part of our reality. They think they're a different substance, a different type of thing to physical substances, and that's the sort of thing that I don't think exists.
Well, substance is a really problematic word because,
of course, it is. We're in ontology; everything's problematic.
Exactly. In physics, we don't understand the substance of anything. We have no idea what the substance of physics is. We thought we used to.
Yeah. So actually, I can maybe clarify that. So if I talk about something physical, what I have in mind is probably something that can be reduced to quantum physics. I mean, but that's not going to be perfect, right? But that might be a starting point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those involved in quantum physics are now feeling we're not at the end of the rabbit hole here. It's a very interesting little cavern within this rabbit hole, and there's lots seems to be going on, but by no means is it the final depth.
Quantum physics may be reducible to something more. I mean, we know that it is, right? Because we don't have a quantum theory of gravity yet, so that there needs to be a unification that will happen at some point, right? But there are people who believe in things that are wholly non-physical and that are not reducible to quantum physics, like a lot of conceptions of God or spirits or immaterial minds. From different traditions. And those are the sorts of things that some people have postulated are necessary to account for subjective experiences or mind or mental states. And I don't think that those provide any explanatory value beyond what we get from a physicalist understanding. Therefore, I reject them. Now, of course, so I know you don't put yourself in a dualist camp, so I'm not sure exactly what you would say. But my question would just be, well, okay, let's talk about it then. What is the difference? And how does one theory provide additional explanatory power with respect to another?
Okay, well, look, that's really helpful, and that may clarify certain divergence of our views, which maybe I can. My view is that we have different functions, different properties, and that ultimately is diversity within one reality. Probably the discussion between us is where these kind of intersect and meet up. Perhaps there is and it's maybe a terrible analogy. Is there a sort of branching tree of this where different properties branch off in different places? And I take it, and that's a very good, I don't know if it's a standard one, but I take it as one of the better definitions of physicalism that I've come across, that if you like, everything diverges from quantum physics, for physicalism. I think that does open up the need for explanations of what is happening below that level, and therefore there may be some other level of divergence of properties below the quantum level. And I think I would be in the category where I would say, if there is a connection between what operates the brain, in the physical way, and what connects with mind, it is at a state below the quantum level. And if there is an interaction with mind and consciousness, it may even be there or below that level. So in that sense, I would put myself outside of your physicalist kind of definition. However, I think it's probably more important for us, rather than to take these as being kind of inviolable, just completely dialectic or different points of view, that we're now kind of discussing more nuances of what might have better explanatory usefulness for various phenomena. And I think that would be where I would want to have this discussion with persons like you and others, to see what phenomena aren't being covered within, if you like, the physicalist kind of narrative, and what then might help on that. And I think that there are aspects of quantum physics and physics, whatever physics is below that. I think that there are aspects of what the mind can do, and the evidence of connections of consciousness, mental states, intention, and physical states. I think we need to look at, certain what are called anomalous, and they're only anomalous because maybe they don't fit in post-quantum states. But maybe they would be less anomalous if we had a bigger picture of our ontology.
Yeah, so just a couple of remarks on that point. I know that we'll have to be wrapping up soon. So when I say, as a physicalist, I mean everything's reducible to quantum physics. That obviously can't be a definition of physicalism, right? Because we could discover that there's more. I mean, as I said, we know that there's more beyond quantum physics, and there's string theory, or who knows, maybe there's something below that. So I don't advance that as a definition. It's more like as a first draft approximation. That's what I believe is kind of at the grounding of reality, as far as we know, or close to it, and again, subject to quantum gravity and things. So it's maybe a helpful starting point. So I just want to clarify there in case of misunderstanding. But the other thing is, in terms of, what might be existing at a fundamental scale, other things that would fall outside of a physicalist understanding, that's quite hard, actually, because as I think you sort of indicated, it is very hard to define in a more rigorous way what we mean by physical, because we could just discover a new force or a new particle, and presumably that would be part of physicalism, right? So we don't want to define it in terms of current science. So it is difficult. However, what I would say, and this is a much longer discussion, is something like there are types of entities that people have postulated, and again, I'm not saying that you're one of these people, but some people have definitely postulated certain types of entities and or properties that they claim would be outside of any sort of physicalist framework, and I've just mentioned some of them. Immaterial disembodied minds, or gods, or I don't know, magical forces or things like this, that they claim are outside of this framework and are not reducible to any sort of particles or fields that have energy, like quantifiable energy states, or any of the sorts of things that we associate with physical theories. And so when I talk about reducing things to quantum mechanics or quantum field theory or whatever, I have in mind that many of our tools of physics will broadly apply. We'll be able to talk about energy levels and energy states and apply some sort of mathematical framework, and there'll be there'll be conservation laws, and these laws will be reduced to current laws in like special state conditions, like Newtonianism does to, or general relativity does to Newtonianism. So that's a sort of a loose idea that I have in mind. And there are people who have very different ideas, and they say, no, there are things outside that. So I'm not exactly sure which of those two positions you're in. I mean, and again, maybe there's other views as well, but I guess the reason I hold to a view like that is, from my point of view, I don't believe that there are any phenomena that cannot be accounted for within a kind of a physical worldview, and therefore I don't find the need to postulate anything that that exists outside of that framework. So just to clarify that, for example, if a new particle was discovered or a new force, scientifically, I would say, well, we should bring that in, right? Because we have good evidence to believe in it. But there are some people who think that we should say that such things exist because of philosophical arguments or speculations, and those I don't find persuasive, because basically the phenomena that are presented, I find that we have sufficient tools for explaining those within the broad framework that we have. So that's kind of why I want to stick to a fairly minimalist one, because I don't feel the pull to add anything else to that.
Yeah.
I'll just quickly mention that we've got 10 minutes, and if anyone's got any questions, please throw them in the chat. We can try and take a few.
All right. If I think we could maybe kind of round up where we are on this, because I think what you said is important, and it's a very good statement of your position, and it does highlight perhaps what is the difference between us. But what I want to kind of give an understanding is that it's not such a dichotomy in one sense, because just as you feel that, where does physicalism extend to? I kind of think, well, what you're looking at is exploring reality, and you want to go as far as you possibly can in order to explain as much as you can. Really, that's our challenge. And I think that we will find the answers to particular mental states and consciousness functions at that kind of convergence at a deeper level, I'm afraid, than quantum physics, because I think quantum physics is very good at delivering the particles and fields and properties that is part of the world that we live in. But I'm not sure that it is sufficient for giving explanatory value to mind and consciousness. I've chatted with Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff and their quantum kind of ideas of consciousness, and many others who are looking at where to find consciousness. And I think that we just have to be open to suggest that whether we have a kind of commitment to physicalism, or maybe it is part of a larger kind of ontology where we will find convergence, and that will be should be our kind of common quest, where we're going to find this convergence and offer explanatory value. Because at the moment, I'm not sure that a physicalist kind of paradigm has the explanatory power for mental states and consciousness.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I would just add to that I mean, I'm not sure in the absolute sense that it does, but from my point of view, I think that there are reasons to think that it may, and perhaps more importantly, I don't think that there's good reasons for thinking that anything else beyond the physicalism has anything much to add to the discussion, I suppose. Which is why I don't think that there are any such things, but I could be wrong about that, and hopefully we'll work all of this out eventually, and we'll learn more. Almost certainly some of our preconceptions are going to be changed by a full understanding of these things. So I look forward to that.
I agree.
All right. Question from Yadaraj for James. How he accounts for the experience of identity through change. Is it intuitively true that I am the same experiencing entity of my body and mind that I was 10 years ago? Oh, it is intuitively true.
Yeah, I find this is interesting. It seems that people's intuitions differ on this depending on what perspectives they're from. I know that, not that I am very well versed in Buddhism, but I know that they have some Buddhists at least have a very different way of thinking about identity over time. And your intuition is going to be shaped by culture there. But I know a lot of people have that intuition that they are the same experiencing entity, or some will say that they're identical to the mind or person that they were, 10 years ago. I mean, I'm not sure that I share that intuition, regardless of the intuition. I don't think that it makes a lot of sense to say that we're identical to, or like exactly the same as the same person we were 10 years ago because of all the changes that happen. I mean, if you want a technical answer, so there's a view called perdurantism, which holds that people and perhaps other material objects persist over time, so that we're four-dimensional entities. We don't just exist as three dimensions, but we're sort of spread out over time. And you can talk about different temporal slices of people. So that's a bit of jargon to look up if I know you're interested in a more philosophical answer to the question. But maybe a more ordinary person answer to the question was, I'm not sure that we should necessarily trust that intuition, and not everyone necessarily has it. I mean, just because you have an intuition, does that mean that that's the way it has to be? I'm not sure that it does. That's a very complex question, by the way. So I don't intend to say that's a satisfactory answer, but that's what I've got in the time.
You're quite right. I think this kind of harks back to something we talked about a little earlier. That do I define myself in terms of my mental states, i.e., my personality, my outlook, my beliefs, my experiences? Because those are all certainly changing. Or do I identify myself as the subject that is having those experiences? Am I still the same subject, despite the fact that everything about my psychology and mentality may have changed over those years? And I think that's where we talked about the kind of unity and almost perpetual unity of ourselves as the conscious unit. I mean, I still think I was the kid who went to school when I was 5 years old, and I feel that was me. I'm certainly very different now in many ways, but I think that to me is a unity and perpetual unity of my state of being the same entity, if you like.
Yeah, I guess just one, not to exactly disagree with that, but just maybe a food for thought is, for these different positions, like how could you tell if the position was wrong? What evidence would count against it? I think that's helpful to think about in these sorts of things.
All right, Digital Gnosis. Question for Akhandadi. Does Akhandadi feel like he has a burden of proof to show the exact causal mechanism of his metaphysics before he rules out materialism? So it's kind of a reversal of your objection to James.
Well, certainly, a good question. Certainly, I think I have a responsibility to show how an alternative narrative for, if you like, a fundamental state of mental states, fundamental property and fundamental property of consciousness might work, and then to show as if I was able to do that. And then what I should do is demonstrate that it has explanatory power beyond a purely brain-based explanation. And that may be a longer presentation. But I would say that I would have, there is burden of proof on me to at least demonstrate greater explanatory power.
Yadaraj had another point on that last topic. He's pointing out that it's... I think he's saying, that basically you need a continuing sense of identity, or to assume that in order to have a structured society. You can't punish people for a crime they did in the past unless you assume it's the same person.
Yeah, well, I mean, it all depends on what ontological baggage we want to place on the notion of the same person.
Funny.
Sorry? Hang on.
It sounds a bit funny. I wonder why.
Hello? Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you fine. It's just some... Okay, anyway.
Might have just been some background. Yeah, so what I was saying is it depends what ontological importance or baggage you want to put on the notion of the same person. I mean, because I agree that people are the same people over time, right? But if you try to dig into the weeds and ask, are we identical to an early version of ourselves, or, are we the same experiencing agent or something like that? So, I mean, I don't think that there's any legal, like any philosophy of law problems here. Obviously, that's going to be a much longer discussion. But I guess maybe the fundamental point that I would make here is, I don't think that structure of law does require any particularly strong ontological assumptions, right? I think that people often are too ready to say, oh, we must make this very particular understanding of the underlying nature of things in order for this, that, and the other thing to work. I just don't see why we should think that. I mean, there's different ways to understand, the way we think about law and legal tradition or whatever. Does it require that strong understanding? I mean, how could you think about it if we didn't have that assumption? I don't know. I think that's maybe too hasty.
We got some more from Digital Gnosis on his last questions too. What about the exact causal mechanism though, rather than just explanatory power? Like James has to show the exact causal mechanism. Again, a reversal of your objection.
Well, I think the difference is that in the issue of the brain, saying that produces mental states and consciousness, we are saying that mental states and consciousness are in some way part of the same kind of physical system. And as James explained, if we take that back to kind of quantum physics, that within that system of explanation, we should be able to provide a mechanism because they are part of that one thing. I think that the difficulty we have is that we will not be able to reduce mental states and consciousness in that way. And therefore, we're going to be dealing with a kind of interaction at a deeper level where I don't think it's going to be possible to demonstrate the mechanisms as clearly, because we're not saying that we understand those mechanisms as well, but we may be able to show some very interesting utility and applications for that. And at the moment, we're working with a team of scientists in America and some internationals looking at the utility of keeping the understanding of the functions of consciousness and mental states distinct from the neural ones, and looking at how they interplay with one another and seeing if that offers greater benefit in certain applications, particularly within mind-machine, mind-body kind of interactions, prosthesis, and so on, and also within the fields of AI. So I don't think we're going to be able to provide the same mechanism, but we're not making the same claim that the mechanisms are part of exactly the same kind of set of properties that we say we have full knowledge of or increasing knowledge of.
All right, and another question from Nathan of Digital Gnosis. Question for both guests: What could you find out that would reduce your confidence in your current position and maybe increase your confidence in your interlocutor's position? It's probably a good one to finish on. That's the last question we got at the moment, anyway.
Yeah, is my audio better?
Yeah, that is better now. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how that happened. I literally didn't move. But anyway, I just twiddled the plug. Yeah, that's a really good question and maybe a good one to end on. What would increase my confidence? So, I mean, I think that, the main thing would just be look at, a body of literature or research coming from a non-materialist or maybe non-reductive point of view that is able to demonstrate, replicable and explanatory findings with respect to qualia or consciousness or something like that. That would be a broad type of thing. I mean, some of the examples that I cited before, evidence of mental activity in the absence of the relevant brain substrate or sufficiently developed brain, that would be very strong evidence if that was replicable and demonstrable, that there's a clear disconnection between the two. I mean, it depends on exactly what you postulate, but that's just an example of something that would change my mind. But yeah, I really think it's about sort of the, traditions or methodological research paradigms and what explanatory value they're able to add. And so I guess that's what I'm looking for. And there's already quite a diversity of those, honestly, even within a sort of broadly physicalist framework. And so I think it's important to let different perspectives sort of have their best go at seeing what they can do. So that would be my answer. I know it's a bit vague, but that's the best I can do.
And taking the same question, what would reduce my confidence in my position and increase mine in James's? I suppose it would come down to seeing some greater clarity in the mechanisms and the kind of causal relationship, but at least between kind of mental activities and the actual nature of qualia. That would be a very good start. And then perhaps in due course, if someone demonstrated that subjective consciousness, followed from that.
Cool. I think that's the last of the questions. You probably have to get going, but I think one thing that would be nice is both of you have given defenses of various positions which you haven't had time to flesh out. Like James, you said, a full defense of my physicalist views or why I think the brain produces consciousness would take a lot more to explain and we'd have to go into books. So perhaps each of you could just at least point the viewers in a direction where they can go and learn more of, where they could go and see a video or read a book that would defend your views in greater detail.
I'm not sure. I'm often asked, what book would I recommend? And although I have studied much of, Vedanta, I'm not sure that I know of a publication that quite has the same presentation as I would give on this. I've obviously studied books which have got a lot of theological kind of import to them and perhaps present ideas, that are way outside the scope that James was discussing. But I think what's more important is to study kind of this topic broadly and to be open to addressing some of the ideas of kind of our Western philosophy and science. And I think insights from the collective of Vedanta, Sankhya, and yoga traditions have a lot to offer on this one. So, but there is some YouTube videos which I produced last year. There's a series on consciousness, which probably are a little bit more strident than we have been discussing today.
And James?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll say a couple of things. One is I do have some YouTube videos where I talk about I talk about sort of dualism, and I know that's not exactly what we've been talking about today, but there's overlaps with some of the subject matter. So if you just have a look on my channel as well as Nathan's channel, Digital Gnosis, because I do a lot of videos with him, you might find some videos of interest. In terms of other authors, so there's two that come to mind. One is David Papineau, and I know that you've discussed with him before. He's, I think, written some interesting things on these sort of areas. Another would be Patricia Churchland, or the Paul and Patricia Churchland. Don't agree with them on everything, but I think they've got some interesting things to say about these matters. And another broader recommendation I would make is if you're interested in the relationship between mind and brain and trying to understand what we know about these things, I just recommend reading cracking open a neuroscience textbook. One that I would recommend is, this is an older edition, but this is Neuroscience by, it's got it on the front by, what's the name? Mark Baer. I think that's quite accessible. So I just recommend that if you're interested in learning more about the stuff. It's really interesting and rapidly developing field. So there's a few recommendations from me.
Cool. All right. We'll wrap it up there unless either of you have any final points you'd like to make.
No, thank you very much, Arjuna. Thank you very much, James. Really enjoyed the discussion today. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for the invitation, Arjuna.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for coming on, guys. It's a great discussion. And just the audience, if you like this kind of content, be sure to subscribe. You can go and check out James and Akhandadi. He's got James's channels linked in the descriptions, and Akhandadi's it's linked to a website he's got set up. And let us know what you think down in the comments, and hit the like button to help us in the algorithm. Hare Krishna.
Thank you. Bye now.